Excellent. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Joe Monarski. I'm the president of the Charles E. Brown Archaeological Society. I'm welcoming you all here for our talk this evening. We'll have a little bit of a pause here before we get into the proceedings as we let our numerous attendees get themselves logged in. I want to thank our panelists ahead of time, and they'll be introduced shortly. And thank all of you for coming in this evening to learn about this rather unique find that we're here in the lower center part of Wisconsin extremely proud of, but I think that extends much farther away than just our home area. Charles E. Brown Archaeological Society, is an affiliate of the Wisconsin Archaeological Society. So welcome to all members, also, in addition to our other guests. I would like to put in a plug to anybody who is interested in continuing having contact with our organization to be able to get updates on upcoming talks and speakers, not just now, but in the years to come. And that also goes for joining the Wisconsin Archaeological Society and the many, many different opportunities for exploring archaeology that they provide. We have a little bit of society business that I'll touch on very, very briefly, and that's all I'll say on that. This was an election year for Charles E. Brown, and we will have a letter going out shortly describing the results of our nomination committee's search and the procedures that we have now gone through for determining the next set of leaders for Charles E. Brown. So keep an eye on out in your mailboxes, those of you who are members. And please know that we hope we have everybody's updated snail mail addresses so that you guys can all get that information roughly about the same time. How are we doing with the rate of attendees joining here?
Slowing, but still coming in. We've hit
Still coming in.
365. It's a new
Fantastic.
record for Charlie Brown.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tonight, we are very, very pleased to be able to have a team of archaeologists from the Wisconsin Historical Society's Department of Historic Preservation, who will be talking about the dugout canoe that was found in Lake Mendota this past year and the current status of our findings and what our ongoing research will be directed at with this really unique artifact. And so I think I will just very briefly give a quick introduction and throw it over to James Skibo, who will, I think, take it on from there. As I said, I'm Joe Monarski. I'm the president of the Charles E. Brown Archaeological Society. With me from the society are Amy Rosebrough, who is our moderator here and our person in the chair controlling everything. John Broyan, current vice president, is with us as well. And I'm very happy to then introduce James Skibo, Tamara, Thomsen, and Caitlin Zant. So at this point, I'll invite James to take over and introduce the topic for this evening.
Thank you, Joe. And Amy will be, it's not Amy White, it's Amy Rosebrough on the screen. Yeah. She is, I don't know, taking Amy White captive. She's locked in the closet and she's on her computer, I guess.
Am I sharing effectively?
Nope.
What away? Okay. All right. How about now?
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, first of all, although Joe's mentioned everyone's name, I want to say it again. Because one of the benefits of this whole thing, besides finding a really cool artifact, was to work closely with the other three members of the archaeology team. And I came here just in July. And so this was a great opportunity for us to bond because it was a tough, plan and really a difficult thing. Well, it's all going to seem like it went very smoothly, but there was lots of bumps in the road. So let me again introduce Dr. Amy Rosebrough, who's one of the assistant state archaeologists, and our two maritime archaeologists are Caitlin Zant and Hall of Fame diver Tamara Thomsen. And I just, I couldn't have picked three other people to do this with. We all have different talents and skills, and they all came together in this. So it's been a lot of fun, and it's going to continue to be a lot of fun. And so what we're going to do tonight is a behind the scenes story, really, about how the canoe was discovered, how we convinced the Historical Society to recover it, how it was recovered, the archaeological context for the canoe, and the preservation plan and what we plan to do going forward. This is interesting. Amy's got a lot of skills, including, I guess this is PowerPoint. We were out scouting this day for a place to bring in the canoe, and she somehow superimposed this historic etching of a dugout canoe in use. So she's got lots of clever skills, which we appreciate too. And all of you probably heard about this news already, so this isn't going to be a surprise, but this is a very significant find. It's because it's the oldest intact canoe in Wisconsin. It's the only canoe that was found with associated artifacts. It's the only canoe that was found in deeper water. As Tammy will mention going forward about some of the other canoes found in Wisconsin, all of them that we know of were found in shallow water because it was the tradition for people to sink their canoes in the fall to preserve them, to hide them, and then bring them up in the spring where they could be put back to use. This canoe has a different story. We believe it was a fishing boat. It's Wisconsin's first shipwreck. It went down for a reason which we could talk about. So it's a pretty unique artifact, and one that we're fortunate to not be a part of, because this canoe has a different story. And to start us off on the story is Tammy, who's going to talk about the discovery of the canoe.
Okay, so next slide, Amy. So I like to dive. So even when I'm not working, I tend to really like just being underwater to relax. And so it was June 11th, and it was a Saturday, and it was one of the first Saturdays I had had off in a long time. And so I asked one of the girls from the dive shop, this is Mallory Draw, if she wanted to join me for just a pleasure dive in Lake Mendota. The clarity of the water in Lake Mendota is really good in the spring. You can see maybe 30 or 40 feet. And we went to a very popular dive site, which is off the neighborhood of Shorewood Hills in Madison. It's relatively shallow. It runs, there's a wall that runs from 15 feet down to 35 feet. And we took these scooters, which she has in this picture. They're diver propulsion vehicles. They're great big batteries with a fan on the back. And we jumped off the boat, and we were going to go cruising down the wall. And our plan was to chase fish and pick up trash as we went. And we had a plan as far as how long we were going to dive for, or what our air consumption was going to be before we would have to turn back. And we were, as we were going down the wall, we had hit our consumption place in our tanks, and we needed to turn around. And where Mallory stopped, she was hovering. And as I caught up to her, because she was in the lead, she was hovering above the exposed end of a dugout canoe. So again, we were just out cruising around. We were not looking for this or really looking for anything in particular. we were doing nothing but killing time. Next slide. So as we stopped, I pulled out a notebook. This is like a write in the rain paper with a pencil. And I wrote, "That's dugout canoe," on my slate. And she gave me the okay sign, but she pointed at her gauge and said, "We got to turn around and go back." So I made a note um, of how deep we were and about how long it was going to take us to get back to the boat. Um, so we could probably refind it. I wasn't sure though, because you can see in this picture, there's very little of it exposed. It makes sense it's a dugout canoe now, but I always second guess myself. So I thought, well, maybe when we get back, I can talk her into getting another tank and coming out for an afternoon dive so we can make sure. And so we scootered back for another 25 minutes to the boat. We covered a lot of ground getting back there, and we came out to the boat, and she had plans with her boyfriend for the afternoon. She needed to attend a basketball game, so she couldn't go. So I got on the phone, next slide, and I called Amy. And Amy is a very dedicated worker, and she was engrossed in some computer work. She's trying to get caught up on some work she didn't finish during the week. But I told her it was just such a nice day. It took a little bit of arm twisting, but I got her to come with me and to at least sit on the boat while I tried to relocate and tried to, re-swim this dive to make sure that I could find it. So where we found the canoe was in 27 feet of water. It was sort of mid-slope. And I knew about the time from where we had anchored the boat that I had scootered to go find it. So after not much searching, I think I had searched for only about 15 minutes, and I was able to relocate the canoe, and I think we moved the boat down to be a little closer. And then on this dive, I brought I had my work camera. It's a great big thing with me, and took it down and decided to take some pictures so you could take. It's a great thing with digital cameras. You can bring them right back up to the boat, and Amy can see what it looks like on the bottom, because she's not a diver. So next slide. She will be soon enough, right? This is this is what the canoe looked like. I asked her. I took pictures before I removed any of the sediment, and then I asked her. I said, I think I'm just going to kind of follow the edges and maybe hand fan a little bit, and see if it's a whole dugout canoe or a partial dugout, and see how much is there. Again, you don't want to call in the forces and get real excited about this if it isn't. If it isn't complete, if it isn't really significant. So yeah, it's all there. Also, in changing tanks and getting Amy on the boat, I grabbed a tape, and we put a tape on it. It's about 15 feet long, and it was completely intact, just amazing. I had no idea. Next slide. So. And when I came up and with the pictures, Amy said, "Is there anything unusual that you see down there? Are there any artifacts associated with it?" And I said, "No, I didn't really find anything. Even when I was very carefully brushing away the smooth sediment, I didn't see anything except this sort of small, weird pile of rocks. It wasn't what I expected, because I knew that cached canoes were a thing, not in 27 feet of water. That's nowhere anyone would cache their canoe and want to get it back. But it was just strange, this strange pile of rocks in the center. And said, "Well, want to bring them up?" So next slide, I did. And Amy photographed them, and funny Amy. And then she said, I said, "Well, what do you think they are?" And she said, "Well, I don't know, but take them back down." So I took them back down and put them in the canoe. And next slide. And then came back up, and we I hit the man overboards because we were sitting right above the canoe at this point with the boat, so we could remember where it was and get a GPS coordinate. And Amy went back to the office and cataloged it as an archaeological site and processed all the photos. And that's where it sat for a number of months until Jim was hired and was involved. In fact, I went out about 2 weeks later after not really hearing back from anyone, because there are problems with uncovering the canoe. It's sort of, chicken egg, right? You don't know what's there until you uncover it. But then when you uncover it, you expose it to algae, and our lake has zebra mussels, which could burrow into the wood. So again, about 2 weeks later, I went back to the site and I spent about an hour there just pushing all the sediment I could back over the canoe so that it wasn't exposed anymore. When we found it, there was only about maybe 3 feet of it that was unprotected by the sediment. And at the lower end of the canoe, because it was, perpendicular to a slope, there was maybe about 1.5 feet of sediment over it at the time when I uncovered it. So covered it back up and then kind of forgot about it. I didn't forget about it. I kept pushing the issue, but so just kind of this weird circumstance that, why would I even think about whether a dugout canoe is there? I mean, Caitlin and I work on 200-year-old shipwrecks every day, but why am I thinking about dugout canoes, and why would I even notice this thing? Well, in 2018 and 2019, we had a university student who was interested in doing some senior thesis work. And he came to us to try to figure out a project. And his name was Ryan Smazel, and he wanted, the project that we designed for him was to go around the state and look at all of the dugout canoes that are in either private collections or museums or historical societies around the state, and to sort of do a comparative analysis of them. We had a hypothesis that if a canoe was more log-like, then it was older. If it was more pointed on the ends, then they may be more recent. Also, canoes have different features, and we wanted to kind of understand those. You can see in the bottom mosaic here, the canoe has what are called thwarts. So they either compartmentalized the vessel, or they were something that you could kneel against or push against as you were rowing, paddling the canoe. And so it kind of gave us this background. Well, Ryan, he was uncomfortable really driving long distances, and he didn't have a whole lot of experience with sketching and drawing to scale. And so Caitlin and I accompanied him on a lot of these trips to go visit the canoe. So there are 36 or 37 of them that are known that he was able to uncover in these collections. And I think between the two of us, we went to 25 or 30 of them with him. So I have this exposure to dugout canoes. They live in the back of my mind now. And so now I guess when I'm swimming around underwater, instead of seeing logs, I see dugout canoes. Next slide. You got to unmute, Jim.
Sorry. So when I came on board in July, in our team meetings, it came up like 3 different times, about just offhandedly about a dugout canoe being in the bottom of Lake Mendota. And it was just sort of, then we just zipped by it. And then I finally said, well, tell me more about this canoe. And then Amy, just like she's doing here, pulled up some pictures. And I said, wow, that seems unlikely that that's an old canoe, because it's in such good condition. I mean, think about wood, how long wood will last. in a lake, exposed to the sun and the water and the light. Not long. We're talking years, not hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, but the net sinkers made it seem like it might be old. The objects in there. We'll get to the net sinkers in a little while. So I went to I'm a member of the collections committee at the Historical Society, and I said, hypothetically, if there was a dugout canoe, because I'm brand new, hypothetically, if there's a dugout canoe in the bottom of Lake Mendota, would the Historical Society be interested in retrieving it? And there was some hemming and hawing. And I said, yeah, we think, why do you think there's a dugout canoe? I said, well, there is, but I don't know if the Boy Scouts made it in 1950 or if it is old. And I said, there's only one way to find out. We should probably get a carbon date, because archaeologists, above all things, don't want to look stupid and make a mistake and be tricked. Archaeology, like life itself, is full of trickery. So I suggested we get a carbon 14 date. So and we did. Tammy and I went back out. She went in, and she found the canoe. This time the water was very murky. Again, if you're familiar with the southern Wisconsin lakes, they get full of algae, and the visibility was like 6 inches or 8 inches. And she dove into this soup, and I could see the bubbles going back and forth and back and forth, basically trying to feel for the canoe. So it was miraculous that she found it again. And she did. And she got a little sliver. And next slide, please. Again, this is no surprise. This was, it dates to about 1,200 years ago. And if you've been reading the news, you know about that. So I went back to when I got this date, and we walked into Christian Overland's, our director of our museum's office. And I said, look, this canoe is old, and it is significant, and it's a kind of a one-of-a-kind thing. What do you want to do? And he said, what do you recommend? I said, well, now that it's exposed, it's miraculous that it lived this long and lasted this long. And now that it's near the surface, it's not going to last long. And it may disappear. We may not be able to find it again next spring. So I would suggest we take it out fast. This was in October. And he said, come up with a plan. And next slide, please. And so we spent the next 6 weeks coming up with a plan. And it was a lot of sleepless nights, I think, for some of us, and a lot of practicing and a lot of experimenting and a lot of different kinds of things. But to Christian Overland's credit, he said, this could be our Rosa Parks moment, because he was a member of the Henry Ford Museum outside of Detroit. And they purchased at one point the Rosa Parks bus. And it was an all museum effort. And he turned this to an all museum effort. And without him saying it's go time, I mean, things move slowly in bureaucracies, even more so in museums and historical societies. So the fact that we went 6 weeks from learning it was old to extracting it was a miracle. So we came up with a plan. And I think what's the next slide? I think Tammy's back. Yeah.
So I have never brought a dugout canoe up. In fact, in the 18 years I've worked with the Historical Society, we have only brought up one artifact. So we needed to call in some experts. My first stop for trying to understand what we needed to do and what the breadth of this was to get in contact with Dr. Richard Boyd. Dick has been a real advocate for our program throughout the years, but also, a volunteer for us and oh so helpful. He's recently retired head of global manufacturing company, and they really provided a lot of support for if you wanted to do something strange underwater or different or outside the range, they would definitely be the people to contact and help. So I called Dick up and I said, I knew he had used a water dredge before. He and his group were part of the raising of the Alvin Clark back in the 60s. So I knew they had used these massive water dredges to dredge out the shipwreck. And so I said, well, Kim Stabelfeld at one point had dropped off when he was cleaning out his house, had dropped off an airlift dredge to me, and it had been sitting around for a number of years. I thought, well, instead of us having to buy something, maybe I can get this thing to work and figure it out. So I talked through it with Dick, and he said, it just doesn't look like it's going to work. He said, but you know what? If you go out and you try it, you'll learn an awful lot by doing. And so I think I got Amy on the boat, and last minute call, asked her if she could, and she was in her nice dress clothes from work, and we jumped on the boat and went out into Lake Mendota, and I tried the airlift dredge. And it worked, but it worked slowly. And I thought, well, we're going to need a lot of help if this is the way it's going to go. So I'm friends with a couple guys on the Dane County Sheriff Department dive team. And I asked them if they would want to come and try it to sort of learn how other people used it and if this was going to be viable. And Jim came with me, and we watched him work, and it didn't work. It was too slow. We were constantly fighting, trying to keep the thing at the right exact level above the bottom sediment to suck up the sediment, and it was moving too slowly. And so I went back to Dick, and Dick sent me this picture. I don't know what book he copied it from, or his notebook or whatever. And he said, build this. And I thought, well, oh my gosh, I don't think we have time to build this. I have no idea what I'm doing. So I called around, next slide. And I have a friend over in the Manitowoc area named Randy Wallander, who runs sort of a commercial outfit. They do a lot of work on the piers and marinas that are along Lake Michigan. He works with his son, and he has all sorts of tools and equipment to do this. And if you ran your boat up on a breakwater, he would be the guy to call to get it off. You'd lose your fishing boat in 90 or 100 feet of water. He's the guy to call to lift it. And so I was talking to him about this water dredge that we were going to try to build. And he's like, well, I have one. I just picked one up from a gold dredging operation in Alaska. It's like, so if you want to come and borrow it, he's like, I got a project I'm using it for, but you can come and borrow it for a little bit, but I have to have it back. And so I said, okay, well, Random Manitowoc picked it up. And we went back out, and oh my gosh, that thing, it really sucked sediment. So Amy and I again went out and we were trying the thing out, and it was sucking a lot of sediment right away. So that was what we were going to use. But he was used to dredging and just dredging things away from the dredge spoil away from the area that he was working, and not actually pumping it up to the boat. So we need to figure that out. How we were going to pump it up 30 feet into a boat to screen. And then we also needed to figure out how we were going to lift this thing, because again, I didn't know how much it weighed, no idea what to expect. So Randy created this sort of idea on a piece of cardboard with a marker, and he said, build this. And it was this sort of hammock, this gurney, with poles and and canvas. This is scrap canvas that he found in a barn, to be able to lift the canoe and bring the canoe to the surface. And then these spreader bars were constructed to sort of keep the canvas from folding up on the canoe as we lifted it. Next slide. Then we needed manpower. And so I went back to my friends at the Dane County Sheriff Department. I've done a lot of training with them over the years, and so I know a good portion of their dive team and have worked with them before. And I made Jim ask for permission to use the team to help us. Well, it turns out that a lot of these guys work in the jail, and they worked third shift. So it was going to be impossible to get them out to spend more than a day or so with us. And so I looked at Caitlin, who's sitting in the office, and I'm like, we're gonna have to do this all ourselves. We're gonna have to get the all of our volunteers that can come out to come out and help us dredge this thing, around it, to make sure that I didn't accidentally miss some artifacts that may be, somewhere around the canoe. But then also to, make sure that it's free from the bottom. And so the sheriff department was available to us on the 2nd of November. That was one of their training days. And so all of these guys had in their schedules that they needed to show up for dive practice. So we could use them that day. So that became our day for when we were going to lift the canoe, and we worked backwards from there. And so then it was about, how long was it going to take us to dredge this thing out? How many volunteers could we get? And what we needed to do ramping up to that November 2nd date. Next slide.
Right, so as Tammy mentioned, we had a lot of work to do and not very many people to do it. And so we were very lucky that we were able to get a group of our volunteers to come down and, in the end of October, come down and help us out. So our first volunteer, Chris Spoo, has been volunteering with us for quite a few years. He came out with us on the very first day that we went out. And our first thing to do was to re-find the canoe once again, because Tammy had recovered it since getting the carbon, or the sample for the carbon-14 dating, to try to keep it as protected as possible while we were waiting for all of this to go on. And so Chris came out with us, helped us re-find the canoe. And then once we got that in place, we put in a permanent mooring, or a semi-permanent mooring, right near the site, so that we didn't have to continually locate the canoe every day. And then also so we wouldn't have to be dropping an anchor every day, potentially damaging the site. So on the first day out on the project, it was cold, it was windy, it was not a pleasant day. But Chris and Tammy were able to jump in the water, find the canoe, and then put this mooring that would be there for the length of the project in. After we got that portion continued, Chris also went down to help. We started to take a look at the artifacts that were still there. A lot of the sediment on top of the canoe had been moved around a lot, and so it was fairly easy to hand fan off. And one of the first things we wanted to do was make sure we recovered the net sinkers that were found inside. And so here we have an image of Chris returning to the surface with those net sinkers for us. Next slide. After day one, Chris had to go back to work. And so we were very lucky to get our longtime volunteer, Russ Lights, to come down and assist with the rest of the dredging project. Russ has been a volunteer with us for about the last 30 years, and he is almost 80 years old. And he did most of the dredging on this project, I will say. He was, Russ wanted to be a part of this, and we were really fortunate that he was available to come down and help us. So with Russ's help, we were actually able to dredge the entire canoe out in about 4 days and get everything going. And so, like I said, he did most of that sediment removal in that 4 days and really, really helped us out. Next slide. So day one of dredging, we got the entire dredge system set up. We started the dredge process. Our original plan was to take all of the sediment from around the canoe, bring it up to the surface, and then sort through it. So Amy and Jim could sort through any of the sediment coming up from around the canoe, because we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss any other artifacts that might be in and around this site. The canoe itself is sitting on that slope, and so we weren't sure how much of that sediment had been moved around, or if there really was any kind of in situ artifacts around the outside of the canoe. So we wanted to make sure that that was something that we double checked and sorted through. As you can see here, We did a lot of it on day one, but we kept running into issues with the dredge itself and also the piping. The pipes clogged. We had numerous hoses burst. We don't have a great image of it, but there's one where a geyser of water went shooting up for the top of the boat. And so we were kind of fraught with all of these issues. But at the end of the day, on day one, we discovered that there weren't really any artifacts coming up. It was mostly just this loose sediment that had been moved about, on the surface of the bottom substrate. And we weren't really finding anything else nearby. And so after this, we decided that we were going to nix that plan and just instead move the sediment, keep the sediment all underwater and move it off to the side, which from that point on, the dredging began to go much faster than it had been going. And that's also why we were able to get the project done in that 4-day time period. Next slide. So while we were doing this dredging project, and when we first started, up near the end of the canoe where that was broken and kind of more deteriorated, there were additional pieces of wood that kind of started to come loose out of that sediment and tumble down onto the site and the canoe itself. And so while, after talking about this a little bit, we decided that we were going to bring any piece of wood up that we located near the site to take a look at it and determine whether or not it was a piece of the canoe or a log, a branch, a bark, any kind of things that, or some other kind of artifact that was coming up. So while over the course of the project, we brought up 4 or 5 pieces that we believed to be bits and pieces of that kind of deteriorated end of the canoe. And then also a few additional wooden artifacts that we're not entirely sure what, where or what exactly they came from. While we were doing this process as well, we, as we're digging through this kind of loose sediment, one of the things that did end up coming up or, coming out from underneath the canoe were 2 peach pits. And we disturbed a family of crawfish that were living in that area as well. So while peach pits were not native to this area at the time of the canoe, we're not entirely sure, but it's something, an avenue we're going down, but we believe that the crawfish actually brought those peach pits into their home underneath the canoe. So that was a kind of fun little thing that we found that we did not expect. But otherwise, we brought all those loose pieces of wood up to the surface. You can see Jim holding one of them and taking a look. At least 2 or 3 of those pieces are from, you can see kind of the center of the wood or the center of the tree rings. So we are fairly certain that those were actually part of that broken end of the canoe. Next slide, please. So on the last day of dredging, we had dredged out about 2 to 3 feet out on either side of the canoe, kind of in a V shape down to the bottom of the canoe. But as we got to the end of the canoe, the deeper end of the canoe that was more intact, it was actually sitting on the original clay bottom substrate that we had in Lake Mendota, which was really suctioned the canoe in place and was much harder to remove with the dredge. So we made use of our water pump or water jet here, or water probe that was able to kind of get that last couple inches that was holding that canoe in place right underneath it on the very last day. Tammy was having some fun with it. It was very high powered, as you can see, but that really kind of made that process pretty quick and easy. And we were able to get the canoe to kind of pop out of place. And one of the most interesting things that we didn't anticipate or didn't know about when we first were looking at it was just how heavy or how light the canoe would be underwater. And as soon as that kind of last connection with the bottom sediment was lifted, the canoe could basically be lifted with a few fingers. And so when we found that out, we realized that the canoe was much lighter than we had originally anticipated, and that we had to figure out a way to keep the canoe in place. So now that we have the canoe completely out of its protective elements, we then had to wait until the day that the sheriff's department was available to actually bring the canoe up out of the water. And so we devised a system to kind of tie down the canoe as best as we could without damaging it, so that it wouldn't move or get damaged over the course of the weekend while we were waiting. Next slide, please. So the Canoe Recovery Day, November 2nd, the magic day that Tammy had talked about, came, and it was 32 degrees, scheduled to be, or was forecast to be 32 degrees by midday. So when we started, it was well below freezing air temperature, and the water temperature was quickly dropping. And one thing that we had not anticipated was the lowering of the lake levels. So they had, in between the time that we started this project to the day that it was time to bring the canoe out, the water level in the lake had dropped about 1.5 feet. And so that was something else that we had to contend with that day that we didn't originally anticipate. But on November 2nd, the entire team was ready and we set out to go. Next slide. So the cast of characters we had that day, we had a wide range of people out on the water with us. First and foremost, in the front boat there, we had Russ Lights, our volunteer, then local historian Dan Sanford out with us. And then in the second boat, you see we have our beautiful 21-foot Boston whaler, the Dawn Treader, with Tammy, Jim, and then our Randy Wallander, our other volunteer, on board, along with another camera person. Then we also had the Sheriff's Department boat with the Sheriff Department divers and myself. And then there was also another pontoon boat out there with some media and some other members of the film crew out there as well. Next slide. So when it came time to get in the water, Tammy and Randy jumped in the water. The day before this day, Tammy and Randy had gone down to the site and had put that sling underneath the canoe. Once we knew how light the canoe was, we realized it only really needed 2 people to kind of help shimmy that the homemade sling underneath the canoe. And so everything was set and ready and in place for when the sheriff's dive team got there. And so it was Randy, Tammy, and then 4 of the Sheriff's Department divers hopped in the water and then swam down to the site. And our first goal was to rotate the canoe. Since it was on this that slope, we really wanted to make sure that before lifting it, it was on an even plane. And so all 6 divers kind of went down and pivoted on one end and turned the canoe so that it was then sitting in a position for Randy to rig up his lift bags for the lifting. Next slide. After everything was rigged properly with the sling, Randy started to slowly inflate the lift bags, and the divers kind of guided the canoe up as it was rising to the surface from about 27 feet of water. Here you can see Tammy and a couple of the other divers in the water making sure that everything's secure and that the canoe was coming up all together and that one end wasn't coming up faster than the other end. Next slide. Once on the surface, the canoe, or the bags were on the surface, the canoe was sitting about 3.5, 4 feet underwater. Here you can see some of the divers in the water, including Randy, kind of making sure that the final adjustments were made, the lift bags were secure, the canoe was secure to prepare it for being towed back into shore. Next slide. So once we got everything secured, the canoe was actually transferred over to the Sheriff's Department boat for the actual towing in. The Sheriff's Department boat was able to have kind of a more consistent lower speed than our boat and had a little bit better towing capacity than our boat did. So that's why we transferred it over to them. And so to prepare for this, one of the Sheriff's Department dive team members stayed in the water with the canoe and kind of to swim along with it as it started to go in. And then we started our about 1.5 hour trek back into shore, going at less than 1 mile an hour most of the time. Next slide. As we were coming in, the wind was picking up, the waves were kind of picking up. And so Tammy, Jim, and the Dawn Treader was kind of used to break the waves as much as possible, but also lead the way, making sure that we wouldn't hit anything, because we did know that we had that the canoe dangling about 3 feet underwater, and so we wanted to make sure that the canoe stayed in its space and it didn't kind of get whipped around too much. And so that diver, we had 2 people on the back of the sheriff's boat watching the canoe, and then also the diver who was watching the canoe and actually holding on to it, making sure that the canoe was staying in place. Next slide. As we got a little bit closer into shore, we realized that we couldn't just make a direct cut into shore, and that it got shallow pretty quickly. So we had Tammy and the Dawn Treader kind of giving the sheriff's department boat a play-by-play in terms of depths to figure out what the best angle to come into the beach was so that we could get as close as possible before switching over to the swimmers and the other people in the water to carry the canoe to shore. We did have to stop for a little bit of time to have Randy kind of readjust everything because the canoe again was sitting about 3 feet below water. We had it lifted up so it was even closer because the lake levels had dropped so much. So we had to really hoist up the canoe as much as possible so that we could get it in close enough to shore to then begin the process of actually transporting it from the water and onto land. Next slide.
So the team was also communicating via text chain with those of us on shore. And I had stayed behind that day to sort of be a media contact on the beach where the canoe was headed, along with Sophie Stewart, who was working with the Maritime office at that point. And the idea was that I would represent terrestrial archaeology, talk about the time period that the canoe belonged to, and Sophie would take care of interviews regarding the dive team and what it's like to work underwater. And originally, we were told that there would be a select number of media representatives there, and maybe some of our staff would come out because it, again, was a very cold day, absolutely frigid, and that it's, as the text chain indicated they were coming to shore, Sophie and I would then switch into a pair of dry suits and then wade out into the lake in order to assist with the final leg of bringing the canoe back in. So this media showed up and we gave a small number of interviews. The park was fairly deserted at that time. But once the media was done with this, I turned around and noticed that there were more people in the park at that point than I had expected. We had the film crews, of course, including one videographer who was running a drone. So the drone was buzzing around us, past our heads, back and forth out over the lake and then back to shore at fairly regular intervals. Society staff began to show up, including Christian Overland here in the lower left, the director of the Wisconsin Historical Society, along with other members of our administrative staff and historic preservation. Bill Quackenbush, the upper left, is a Ho-Chunk tribal representative, heads the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And he had come to both represent his nation and out of personal interest because he has interest in canoes in general. The media then began to descend on these representatives and individuals. And this is a neighborhood. People were walking their dogs, noticed the crowds beginning to gather. They'd come up and ask someone, hey, what's going on? And well, there's this ancient canoe being pulled out of the water today. Oh, really? And then they'd get on their phones or go back home and get on Facebook and call the neighbors. And soon more and more and more people were gathering in this little park. And soon some fairly famous folks started to show up as well. After a brief bit, as I'd gotten into the dry suit as they were on their way in, someone said, hey, could you come talk to the mayor? And like an idiot, I said, what mayor? Which mayor? And they said, the mayor. Oh, that mayor. Yes. So I went over and gave her a personal little tour and talk about what was going on, caught her up to date. And then said, you know, we've had an alder, the neighborhood alder has shown up, and he has mentioned perhaps contacting Madison Police about having an escort for the canoe so that it can get safely to our preservation facility. And the mayor said, oh, is that what you need? She pulled out her phone and a couple of buttons later, next thing you knew, Madison Police were starting to show up as well and adding to the crowd. So I had to wonder, what the folks on the boats thought was going on. By that point, the DNR had showed up with the trailer that was going to be used. The drone is still flying back and forth. There are dogs running around. And everyone is mingling happily, sitting side by side at picnic tables and asking people who were in on the text chain what was going on and just having a grand old time, despite the fact that it was extremely cold still. And then they were there.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. We couldn't get close enough. Excuse me, with the boats. Excuse me. So we had to walk the canoe in the rest of the way. And also, Randy decided he was just going to swim it in for a while. He's kind of a cowboy, but he was fun to have along. And at this point, I sort of realized there was sort of buzz as we came ashore that this was different than any sort of archaeological stuff I've done before. I've been doing archaeology for a long time. I've found lots of significant things. But now as the state archaeologist, the people's archaeologist, our job is to do things that are a little more in the public eye. And this was, I learned something this day because it was, people stood there for 4 hours in the freezing cold. They clapped when he came out. People were crying. It was kind of an emotional experience. So it touched me, and I'll never forget it for sure. And I think one reason why it was so moving is that it's likely that this canoe is coming to the shore where it took off 1,200 years ago, because there's a habitation site right nearby. And it's, we're seeing something that hasn't no one seen or touched for 1,200 years. So it was kind of an important moment, I think, more so. I didn't realize how important it was until just right now. Next slide. And also, Amy already mentioned Bill Quackenbush, but I forgot to mention all the tribes of Wisconsin were notified prior to us going and bringing out the canoe, getting their input. And Bill Quackenbush was especially supportive of this, and we appreciate it. Of course, the Ho-Chunk are the likely descendants of the people who made this canoe, and continues to be supportive. And he, in fact, has his youth building a dugout canoe. And this coming summer, he plans to do a canoe trip with the dugout canoe and go over to where the dugout canoe was found. We may have another shipwreck out there, so we'll see. But he's been very, very supportive. Next, please. Just a quick, we've introduced a lot of our team's members, but I want to introduce a couple more. One is with the Wisconsin head is Felipe from the SHPO staff. He's an archaeologist. Also up in the upper left with the baseball cap, that's Lieutenant Stacy, who's the captain of the ship and the head of the Dane County dive team. And you see the Dane County divers, and it was a big moment for us and a big relief. And we're all seem very happy. But, there was a ways to go. Next slide, please. We got it out of the water, and part of the planning process, Tammy and Caitlin took the lead on getting it out of the water, and Amy and I really took the lead on what to do. And the collections team at the museum, especially Scott Roller, about what to do next. And part of the thing I was concerned about is our bumpy Madison roads and going down, and after all this, have it break in two. So it helped to have a police escort. They went 15 miles an hour, and they made it to the State Archival Preservation Facility, the state of art facility we have here as part of the Wisconsin Historical Society. Next, please. And what do we do with the canoe once we bring it out? Well, none of us are wood preservationists, so we had to do a lot of research and get some help. And what it has to do, it has to be put right back into water. And so there's different ways to do this, but it seemed the way that was best for us was to build a vat. We tried to find contractors who would build this vat. But if you're familiar with Madison or just any, construction people today, you can't get them on short notice. They said, we could do it in March or something, but no, we needed it this week. So I volunteered, and Scott Roller volunteered from the collections team, and we built the vat according to specifications of Peter Fix from Texas A&M, who's built a number of these vats. It's built especially strong because it's in the large artifact area in safe. And the thing that they were most concerned about is this 300 gallons of water leaking out or having catastrophic failure. This is it drains quite a ways away. So they encouraged me to make it as strong as possible. And I tell you, this is the strongest vat, I think. Next, please. We also lined it with two layers of pond liner. And you see Tammy and Caitlin helping put that in. Next, please. We've been sort of seeing film people. One of the great things that Christian Overland did, along with our communications people and the other members of the executive team at the Historical Society, is they said, if we're going to do this, we're going to make it we're going to record this. So they hired this group called Purple Onion, which has been filming since October. They filmed our meetings. They filmed us building the vat. They filmed us in, they were a little bit intrusive actually, but they're a lot of fun. And we're actually being interviewed again tomorrow because the goal is to, this canoe has multiple stories to tell. One is the story of it being discovered and preserved. And the other story is, of course, about fishing, about transportation, about how people made this technology. Next, please. So the canoe, and we also plan, you see Scott Roller with on the upper right and the back, and he was instrumental in developing a plan about how to get this thing in the vat. And we anticipated it would be very heavy. The worst case scenario would be so heavy we couldn't lift it. But with humans, we had a plan to lift it with like a small forklift they have. And so we practiced, we went through various scenarios. Thankfully, it turned out to be pretty light. And so it could be lifted, which solved some of the problems. I should also mention this sort of towels and gauze that are wrapped along the edge. The canoe was on a slope like this. The top edge was eroded out. When Tammy saw the canoe, that's what she saw. And that part had broken down some and was cracked. So while underwater, Tammy and others wrapped this with gauze and strapping and to keep the whole thing from splitting. So, okay, we're walking it over to the vat. Next, please. And then we also had a lot of scenarios of how to put this thing down, but it turns out we could just lower it down like you'd lower down a coffin in the Old West. This is a good shot also to point out a couple of things. We don't have any great photographs of the canoe right now because it's underwater. We're going to bring it up and scan it, but this is a good one. It still has some sediment in it, so it's a little hard to see. But you could see that the blackened, this is charred. This is a great evidence of how the canoe was made. Think about people trying to chop down trees and to hew out something like this. And we subsequently have found out through forest products on the University of Wisconsin campus that this is oak. And so, I work with oak all the time, and to think about doing it with stone tools, makes my fingers hurt. and they, so it's remarkable. So we hope to find more about how this canoe is made, why it sank, and learn more about its life history. But this charring certainly has a good clue. The fact that, and maybe part of it's the why it survived. Next, please. The tidal wave of fame. Yeah, this. I knew this was going to be a big deal. I think Christian Overland perceived it would be a big deal. And it turned out to be a bigger deal than anybody would have thought. The story within 2 days, the story had been in Japanese television and papers in Australia, in the Guardian in London. We were interviewed multiple times by various sources, CNN, and it really is continuing. For some reason, this story touched people in ways that I hadn't predicted, in part because maybe it's been a dark time in the news, so it was really a happy story. But also, I think that it's a powerful thing to sort of bring this thing up from the deep like this. So next slide. And it's just a quick sketch of some of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, the Madison paper here. and many paper, it was repeated. These stories were repeated literally hundreds of times. And this just in the past week. Next slide, please. If you are familiar with the show, the BBC show called Time Team, which is an archaeology show that's very popular, and they have a top 10 list of discoveries in the world, and they said the canoe was one of the top 10 discoveries in the world, which was phenomenal. And all my archaeology friends are pissed off, I have to say. So I don't know if this was worth it, but the so it really, it really has reached a lot of people, which is amazing, and it's going to continue to, I think, tell an important story as we go forward. Next, please. Here we have the legislative. The canoe is now in tap water. The preservation process is to just let it sit in water, and it's sitting in regular tap water right now. And it's going to stay this way until we start the preservation process, which I'll talk about in a second. And we had a tour for legislators, and a bunch of legislators, state representatives and state senators came by, and they were really into this canoe. And we gave them, short talks. Next slide, please. And then Caitlin and Amy talked about the net sinkers and the context. It was really amazing, Next slide, please. And of course, our Governor Evers and the First Lady visited. And, it's kind of amazing. I've been with the governor now twice in 2 months. I say I have been, but Tammy has really been with the governor twice in 2 months. The Noah Sanctuary, and our other big story, the Noah Sanctuary just was announced. I think it was September, and she had 45 minutes with the governor. And when the governor came here, and he said, "Tammy, why didn't you tell me about this canoe?" And Tammy said, "Well, Jim Skibo made me keep it a secret," which is not true. But so I mean, even the governor was excited. So that's pretty cool. So let me just say a few things now about what's going forward. In about 2 weeks or so, we're going to start the preservation process. We're putting together a preservation plan with consultants. And the preservation plan includes first putting some biodeterrents in, like pool chemicals, which we did to kill the organisms or zebra mussels or whatever's in there. And then in about 2 weeks, we're going to lift it out, clean it up, and do a 3D scan of it and take as many photographs as we can. And we also are inviting a team of experts to participate in this, local people and people from other places, people who know about the lake. We want to know the life history of this canoe, why it sunk, why it was, how it was made, what is the wood, what was the process, as much as we can. They oftentimes say Lake Mendota is the most studied lake in the world. We're going to make this the most studied canoe in the world. But first we have to take some pictures, put it back in, and it's a 2.5-year preservation process. And so after we put it back in now purified water, it's going to sit here for 2 to 3 years in with gradually adding polyethylene glycol, or PEG, and PEG will replace the water in the cellular structure of the wood. So because the only thing that's really holding this together is the water, so we'll need to get the water out, replace it with PEG, and then after 2.5 years, it'll be freeze dried at minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit for a period to remove the remainder of the water. And at that point, then we can more safely move it. It'll be stable. It can be displayed. The new in 2026, a new museum is going to open. They're excited about making this a centerpiece of it. There's lots of work that we're going to do on this as we go forward. I should also mention that there was a tour came through the other day with people that just called up and said, I want to see the canoe and I want to donate to to the fund to restore it, which didn't exist. So we now have a fund to restore the canoe. So if you want to donate to it, you could go to Wisconsin Historical Society, the website and the foundation, and you could tell them, I want to help preserve this canoe. It's a expensive process. Your tax dollars, if you live in Wisconsin, are paying for this. But this was a surprise, and they'd prefer if I could generate some money. So as we go forward, next slide.
All right, so as the canoe is about to come out, we'll start learning about it. In the meantime, we've been trying to see what we can find out about the canoe and its contents here on land. What we do know is that it is situated in a part of the lake that is very near some contemporary villages and mound sites. So if you look up at the bluffs from the canoe location, you see Eagle Heights off to your left looking south, and then to the right, the Merrill Springs area and the Black Hawk Country Club. This is a period photograph of the goose effigy that's up at the top of Black Hawk Country Club, survives today. And I'm hoping you could see my cursor. That is the goose right there. The star denotes the canoe find location. And you can see that just over here, we have a string of effigy mound sites, and these sort of house-shaped structures indicate contemporary village locations. So the effigy mound population, the late woodland population living here at 800 AD, is living mostly around Merrill Springs, the Spring Harbor neighborhood. What we know about the villagers is that they're probably there occupying warm weather seasonal villages. They've got probably 2, 3, 4, 5 or more houses of bent pole construction covered with matting from woven cattails and rushes in the form of, we'd call it sort of an igloo form. They're called keyhole houses in Wisconsin. So we'd have small groups seasonally located here in Madison, sustaining themselves through bow and arrow hunting of deer and other small game. They'd be growing gardens with corn, sunflowers, squash, no beans yet, because beans haven't arrived in Wisconsin, a little bit of tobacco, and then lamb's quarters and some other native plants. They're making wonderful pottery, decorated with woven cordage, and some of that pottery preserves the impressions of fishing nets, so that we know they had net technology. And a few sites have yielded bone harpoons, conical fish hooks, and conical harpoon, or sort of a toggle harpoon. So we do know that effigy mound people were eating and fishing in the lake. So they were going into the lake to harvest the resources available. The stones, those weird little stones that perplexed me so much that very first day. And later that night, I was thinking, it's not a natural assemblage. They're all the same size and shape. They're all flat, but they're all different raw materials. Some of them looked work, some of them don't. It's very odd. They're obviously in a pile. They're together. They're meant to be in that canoe. And late that first night, so like, wait, I know what these are. These are net sinkers. And net sinkers in archaeological context can be very, very difficult to recognize. When people wanted to weight down the bottom of a drift net or a net wall, they would tie stones to the bottom to hold one end down, and then they'd put floats, for example, bottle gourds or pieces of wood up the top to keep that side of the net on the surface of the water. The same for trot lines. They'd tie a weight to one end of the line, have a float holding the hook up near the surface to catch the fish. And they would just grab usually a nice flat rock, tie the cordage, and walk off. So if you find just a nice flat rock in an archaeological site, you go, look, it's a rock, whatever. But here we had in the canoe a selection of 7 net sinkers. Some of them very obviously worked and chipped so that they had nice notches on either side. Some of them not worked at all, but selected so they were about the same size, about the same weight, and ready to work together as a set, as an artifact set. So we were able to say, this is a set of net sinkers. On land, this would be much harder to do if we hadn't found them together. So kudos for Tammy for noticing the weird rocks in the canoe. The canoe itself, we don't have really any good information about dugout manufacture in Wisconsin. We have some very, very early engravings from the East Coast done a few centuries ago by DeVry, And he shows the process of charring out the inside of the canoe, using fire to bring down the tree, burn off the branches, and then hollow out what's going to be the canoe. You see some people working on it. And notice that blunt squared end on this canoe. Other engravings, the one on the left shows a canoe very, very much like the Lake Mendota canoe, shallow with rounded ends. And you'll notice in all of these images, both the early engravings and then a much more recent photograph of a canoe, similar canoe in use in Florida, you notice that the men are standing in it. So they're standing and paddling, standing and poling, and then passengers and any cargo are then down at the bottom of a very shallow canoe that just sort of lightly skims over the water. And that's really what we know so far. The shape, the manufacture seem to correlate with the early engravings. We know that they're fishing. We know that the people of that time had fishing technology, but we've got proof that they are using the nets and this technology in Lake Mendota. Oh, unmute again. There we go.
This is a composite picture that Amy put together. And one of the things I want to point out here is that hole on the right end. So the left end that's wrapped at this point in this gauze, it no longer has that wrapping, is the part that was sort of broken down. And we have the pieces. I think we have all the pieces. And then the canoe is about 2 or 3 inches thick everywhere, except where the hole is, where it's about a 1/2 inch thick. So one of the questions that we're going to ask going forward and thinking about is, why did this canoe sink? Canoes are one of the most precious objects. Nets are very difficult to make and are precious objects. It would be a big deal if their canoe sunk. And even if you tip over a old canoe like this, it's not going to sink. But it's a knot that where the hole is. Maybe somebody put their heel or their knee through it or something that may have contributed to its sinking. Also, if you recall those pictures of us going out on the day, it started off very calm, perfect day for a canoe ride. Mm-hmm. By the end of the day, we had 2, maybe 3 foot waves. I couldn't imagine being out on Lake Mendota in this, like a paddleboard, essentially, with those kinds of waves. So going forward, we're going to be asking all these questions, learning more about how soil moves and currents in Lake Mendota. We're going to learn more about the wood and how it was made. And I guess is it next for questions?
Yep.
And I just noticed 439 people were here today. So this confirms that there's a lot of interest in the canoe, and thank you all for coming, first of all, and we'll hand it over to Joe to give you instructions about how to ask questions.
All right, and we already have a couple in the Q&A. So yeah, we will be using the Q&A section that'll be down at the bottom of your screens. Now, we do have well over 400 attendees here, and we're looking at an end time in about 15 minutes, I think. So we will get to as many questions as we can. My goal here is, if you will all pardon me, I will do a little curation. There are going to be some questions that I'm already seeing that I think we've touched on. So to keep things brief, I will also try to summarize if there's a couple questions that all touch on the same topic. I will give the first name of the person or persons who ask a question. And then Dr. Skibo will then direct to the appropriate person to answer each one. So thank you all again, before we get too far into this, for attending tonight. And of course, thank you to our panel for relating the story of the recovery of this phenomenal artifact, who, as has been mentioned, whose story we are only just beginning to explore. There's a question I think is a very pertinent one to start out with, and that has to do with the contact with the Ho-Chunk Nation and their involvement in the decision to raise the canoe. And I think, Dr. Skibo, you'd be probably the best to approach that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned that briefly. Even before we decided to take it out, we contacted all of the tribal representatives, and we heard back from a number of them. And Bill Quackenbush has been especially supportive. No one said that we shouldn't take it out. And ongoing, the Ho-Chunk and our other tribal partners will be involved at all points in its interpretation and the story that we're telling. One thing Bill already told me, which I think is fascinating, is that the Ho-Chunk consider oak a sacred wood, and that's kind of a cool thing, because you wonder, why would you make a canoe out of oak? The earliest canoe, the one that's a little bit earlier, where they just have a fragment of it from Lake Mary, it's also made out of oak. I think it's a lot more work to make something out of a hardwood, and they're not as buoyant as other woods. So, that's kind of an interesting part, I would think, of this potential of the story. So they're involved at every level as much as they want to be.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's been a hallmark of the Office of State Archaeologist, under both Dr. Broyan, of course, now under yourself as well, to have this involvement and relationship with the First Nations of Wisconsin. And there are, even from our questioners, a lot of interest in this role played by the First Nations people here in the Ho-Chunk. There are some questions that I'll summarize having to do with materials. Everything from, does there seem to be a particular stone used for the net sinkers? The nets themselves, what would they have been composed of? What fiber would have been used? And what kind of working do you see on the wood itself? Are there tool marks? So a bit of a catch-all there.
Amy?
Sure. So the net sinkers are just about any stone they could find locally. So we have some dolomite, we have some igneous stones. And they were basically just picking up whatever they could find that was roughly the right size and shape and weight, probably along the beaches and shorelines there, and then chipping and napping where they needed to work them down to either notch them or get them to be rounded to get any sharp edges off. So it's basically whatever they could find. The netting based on preserved textile fragments from Wisconsin is either going to be the inner bark of basswood or boiled down fibers taken from stinging nettles. So we can't tell, so we don't have the net, it's long since gone, but based on the impressions in the fabrics that we do have preserved, we think it's one or the other of those. And then the canoe itself, we haven't really had a good chance to look, in detail at the canoe for tool marks. That's something we're going to be doing once it's out and scanned. We know roughly the kind of tools that would be used to work it. Groundstone adzes and chipped adzes. So we'll probably be comparing the types of marks we do find. I do hope we find them with some of the tools we have in our collections here.
All right. Let me find it. Adam asks an interesting question about whether or not, and I think this was kind of hinted at, this could have been purposefully sunk.
Well, I'll take a shot at this. We can't rule that out. Somebody could have put a hole in it, and it would be unusual. This would be the only one that we've found like this. We can't rule it out.
Yeah. We have had a couple of commentators, a couple of questioners pointing out the density of oak and its propensity to sink.
Yeah, right. Loggers would lose logs all the time because they would sink. So, but the fact that it had net sinkers, and as Amy mentioned, suppose there was likely a net attached to these net sinkers. And a canoe and a net, I think, as I mentioned, are very valuable. They take a lot of people hours to make. Some of the most prized possessions. Yeah, I think I lean towards it being an accident, but we can't rule that out. And I don't know if we'll be able to figure that out, but we'll see. We're gonna try to understand its life history from the moment the tree was cut down till the moment we picked it up. Anybody else can add to that? Go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing we do know in terms of if you're, discussing if it was cached or not. We didn't find any evidence that it had been like cached on shore. There were no large rocks. There were no, there was nothing else, and the net sinkers were still in it. So, having if it had like turned over at all, the net sinkers probably wouldn't still be in it. So that kind of adds to, again, our like mystery or our question about what exactly happened here. But yeah, in terms of like if it purposely sunk in terms of like a cache type situation, we didn't find any evidence of that with this. So unless it was cached, brought back up, and then like it was too waterlogged to do anything with, and then they just kind of let it go, maybe, but it's hard to tell.
All right, thank you. Sharon asks an interesting question. What is known about the lake levels at that time?
Tammy, Tammy lives in the lake.
I was gonna say Amy would probably be a better person to answer this because she's done a little bit more research than I have. But we do know that the lake levels were a bit lower. However, not significantly lower to infer that the canoe in 27 feet of water now would have been a reachable depth for someone of that time period, just swimming or wading into the water to reach.
Oh, I see we've got a couple more questions about the distance as well. Yeah, the shoreline hasn't really changed as far as I could tell. The folks who are asking about distance seem to be more concerned about could someone have swum, and survived and gotten to shore. I think that's going to depend on how high are the waves and what else is going on.
It's
At calm conditions, they could have done it. Yeah.
It's a couple hundred yards, so
yeah,
it's swimmable. Even I can swim that.
All right. Amy asks about the continuing contact and involvement of the Ho-Chunk Nation and what their role is here with the canoe.
Well, I just talked to Bill the other day. We were on a joint radio show, actually, and
that would be Bill Quackenbush from
Bill Quackenbush, yeah. And he's planning to have, as I mentioned, when he has this youth group come, they're making a dugout canoe. They want to come and see the canoe, and Bill's going to be involved for sure, and anyone else. There's also a very famous canoe maker. I'm going to get his name right. Maybe is it Defoe?
Mark Defoe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Who has a canoe that he made. It's in the Smithsonian. So we've been in contact with him, and we want to be, they will be a part of the whole story as we move forward.
All right, I think we'll have time for just one or two more here. A couple questions about the scanning technology that'll be used, and whether or not the scanning will be available for 3D printing of models.
Wow. Well, you're getting out of my area. The scanning is going to be done by a group at the University of Wisconsin. I can't remember the name of the group off the top of my head. It's amazing. We have an amazing resource on campus. They're going to do it for nothing. We have that, and they have the. Can you make a printout, a 3D model? I think theoretically you probably could. I don't know, but the reason we want to do a 3D model is just to record it all before we start putting through the peg process. and have something to study and look at during these 2.5 years to try to learn how it was constructed.
And then again, getting along with that kind of data gathering. Here's a question from Rory. Is it possible to use something like ground penetrating radar or other remote sensing to look at the sediments at the bottom of the lake? Does that technology exist?
Kaylin, Tammy?
I mean, yes. Yes, theoretically. There's some better ways of looking at the bottom substrate in terms of like coring and different things that like the Department of Limnology here at the UW participates in and has done in various parts of the lake to actually get that, stratigraphy when it comes to what's on the bottom. But in terms of like finding additional artifacts, potentially yes. I mean, using like magnetometer obviously is not going to work in this situation because we're not going to have anything metal to find, but or probably not. But in terms of like ground penetrating radar, there are certain underwater technologies that we don't have currently to be able to do that. It would be very cool to be able to do that, but in terms of like getting like a stratigraphy and that kind of thing, then that's usually done via core samples.
And we'll be taking some core samples this spring. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, obviously there are a lot of resources.
Joe,
here.
I don't want to speak for the other people, but we still have 345 people listening. So, and lots of questions in the. So we can go. We're the people's archaeologists. So
you tell me what your time limits are.
Well, I'll probably get kicked out of the building and have the police on me at 9.
Yeah,
so...
we do have a window. We do have a window that we have to watch here.
How about 10 more minutes?
10
all
more.
right, that sounds absolutely fair. So let's talk a little bit because there's several questions that also touch upon what is the future for this canoe? Where will it be housed? And what will be its the public display of it?
Well, it's currently in the State Archival Preservation Facility here in Madison, and when times are good, and they do have tours that people can sign up for, and they may actually be going on now, and the canoe is part of the tour, so that'll happen, and there'll be no doubt that this canoe will be, in my mind anyway, displayed in the brand new museum in 2026, which is going to be coinciding when it's going to the preservation process will be done, and that analysis will probably be done. So it's going to be displayed and visible for all.
So right now it is possible to see it with a tour of the Archives and Preservation Building. And then coming down the road, when we have this planned new beautiful state history museum, it'll be a part of those displays.
Sure.
And that is slated to be completed what year?
2026.
2026. Fantastic.
We're also taking donations.
Well, yes.
I'm shameless.
No, and I think almost everybody who's going to be involved in this field and the public who are interested are going to understand that the resources of our state get pulled in a lot of directions, and the past, historic preservation, whether or not it's historic or from pre-European contact, is not exactly a front burner budget priority for a lot of decision makers. So yes, we definitely do benefit from the public's donations, the public's support, because this is a public enterprise. This is all of us working together to help preserve the information about our collective human heritage. So yeah, I think that message should be very well received. A little bit of I think an interesting question here for context, and I like this question, is someone's asking, this is anonymous, when we talk about who the Ho-Chunk people were, they're the Ho-Chunk Nation, what was their territory? What was their world? How much of a presence were they in this part of the country? And the village sites, how prevalent were they?
Well, I'll let Amy ask that question. The Ho-Chunk have a long history,
Yeah.
a history of survival. It's a tragic story of removal and return. But I'll let Amy talk about their area.
Oh, sure. So the Ho-Chunk, as Jim said, there's some oral histories that have been shared that seem to correlate to events that took place in Wisconsin well over 10,000 years ago. So the Ho-Chunk say that this is their ancestral home. We have no information that would dispute that. This is an item that was made by the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk. It is a part of their story. And as we move this canoe forward into the museum setting, we want that voice to be the voice that tells the story moving forward. So we have used terms, Anglo terms like effigy mound people, and we call it the Lake Mendota canoe instead of a native term. But we're still working. Again, if the Ho-Chunk have a name they would prefer for this, we'll move to that. I guess is their story. The population that was here at the time, 1,000 years ago, included ancestors of the Ho-Chunk, also ancestors of people that went on to become the Iowa and some of their relatives that moved west. So the population had not quite yet split and differentiated yet, a split that is attested to in Ho-Chunk literature. The Ho-Chunk went through a number of changes between the period that the canoe was made and the current period, including the arrival of full-on corn farming, so that changed the village size. The Madison area emptied out and the culture transformed into a group that the archaeologists call Oneota, but would have been the definite ancestral Ho-Chunk in eastern Wisconsin. From the historic period, the Ho-Chunk territory seemed to extend from what's now Green Bay south across southeastern Wisconsin into the Madison area and into the far northern bit of Illinois. And then the group that would later go on to become the Iowa is inhabiting the area around La Crosse in the Mississippi drainage at about the same time. So they're inhabiting a fairly large territory that was taken from them by force during the colonial period, and that they have then since returned to. And so I am absolutely thrilled that Bill is going to be coming back with the youth, with the dugout, and sort of reclaiming Lake Mendota and bringing that Ho-Chunk presence and bringing it right into people's faces. It has endured since the removal period, but he's going to get back out on the lakes, and people will see that dugout and Ho-Chunk people on the lakes again, which I'm very excited about.
Yes. I'd like to believe that his work will get as much recognition, the recognition that it deserves. We have a couple more questions here that cover a variety of different topics. The process for preserving with the peg. Somebody asked, I think, a very technical question in part. How was that stumbled upon? And I'll throw in another partial question. Does the chemical additives that are put into tap water in the city, does that have an impact on the current state of what you're doing?
I'll answer the last part of the question, then I'm going to turn to the Maritime archaeologist to talk about the history of peg. The tap water initially was an okay thing to put it in because it's chlorinated and it helped us with the biodeterrence to get rid of the living organisms. But we're replacing it with water that's been created by reverse osmosis, completely purified water. because as everyone knows who lives in Madison, there's hard water here, and we can see evidence of the hard water stains on this edge of the vat right now. We want to use purified water once the peg process starts. And so it's going to take 500 gallons or something we're going to have to collect of purified water. Caitlin or Tammy, do you want to talk about how, wood preservation history?
Or is that a completely new talk?
Yeah.
30 seconds,
yes,
go.
But...
Gosh.
Go, well, okay. I mean, like, briefly. Briefly. So just very surface level. So when anything wooden comes out of the water, it immediately begins to deteriorate and degrade. So over time, the cells inside the wood have deteriorated to the point that the only thing really holding them together is the water that's inside of them. So when you bring that up out of the water and that begins to dry and the water begins to leach out of those cells, the cells begin to collapse. And then that's why you get a lot of wooden things turning to dust eventually. So for many, many years, maritime archaeologists have, tried to figure out a way to put something else inside that cell, like replace the water with something else. And so that for the last long time, has been polyethylene glycol. And so through a very long and complicated process, basically, slowly increasing the level of, or the percentage of PEG inside versus water, slowly replacing that water inside the cells with this PEG to fully impregnate the cells and keep the cells upright from collapsing. Again, there are, a lot of issues with that have come out over the last, 30, 40, however many years with the use of PEG, but that's just kind of the go-to for this. Jim can talk a little bit more about this, but they're starting to talk about kind of new methods in how to do this that will be better for something, especially as fragile and as old as this. And kind of new methods of doing this wood preservation that are kind of up and coming right now. And so that we want to try to work with to best preserve the canoe.
Yeah, the research on this kind of thing is ongoing. PEG's been used for decades, but there's various ways to do it. Freeze drying is the new thing. That's why we're ending with freeze drying. Because what would happen lots of times in these canoes, they end up kind of sticky and clammy, and the people we're working with, the consultants, are working on some state-of-the-art technique. The Dutch are actually leading the way. They're publishing on it right now, and I think we're going to be following that strategy.
Right, fantastic. I'm going to end with one last question. I'm going to say thank you to everyone who's contributed questions. I do apologize. We don't have sufficient time to answer every one of them pertinently and specifically. But the interest is wonderful to see. Saul, and I'm just going to read his question out here because I love his question. And I think it's a good one to end on. It looks like a lot of efforts are made to find volunteers and resources to bring this canoe up after it was out. Even the governor and senators are very much interested. For future projects, would you have done anything differently in terms of obtaining state city support? I guess maybe the question is, what have we learned?
Well, I'll start this, but I would say, that's a good question. I don't know if we would have done anything differently. We set up a plan that was that we really worked on. We practiced, and we had built-in flexibility. And how it ended up coming out was not exactly according to the plan. And so, again, this is a tribute to Tammy and Caitlin, the divers, the way they adapted to, they couldn't see. That's the amazing thing. During that, the water was a little clearer on the dive day, on the recovery day. So I guess if I had to do it differently, I would have try to pull it out, and I can't change the calendar. When the water was clear, that would have made it easier for people.
I was gonna say maybe in the spring when the air temperature was warmer, but the
Oh,
water
yeah.
temperature was colder, that maybe would have been
Yeah.
better.
I mean, but I like the challenge of a good November crisp 30-degree day. But the problem
He didn't
was,
go out on the day it sleeted, Amy. Do you remember that? I remember Jim being in a meeting.
yeah, the weather looks bad. Amy, I'd like you to go.
Yeah, the time frame, Mother Nature was really setting the schedule for us. If we had more time to play with, obviously better weather conditions. And I would have liked to have seen, for example, a Marv Defoe, if we could have gotten him down here in the time we have, and some of the other tribal groups to come in and give, their thoughts on recovery and how it should be treated after. I would have liked to have seen more of them here, but the time frame, especially with COVID going on, it just wasn't possible for a lot of folks to get down that we would have liked to have seen.
I mean, I just think we wouldn't have done anything differently because it was a success. What was everyone's greatest fear? You should ask that question. We talked about our, when we were when it got wavy and I could see the lift bags bouncing, I just had visions of this thing going back down to the bottom or breaking into 5 pieces. All of this was possible, and it came out intact. We didn't drop it, and now it's safe. Everyone was excited when we got out of the water, but geesh, there was a long way to go. And I'll end with one sort of funny story that happened. It had to be, I don't know, it was 5 or 6 o'clock. We started at sunrise, and it's 5 or 6 o'clock now in the afternoon. We're finally putting water into the vat. So we've been gone. No, we're on our 13th hour, and no one had eaten anything. I don't even remember drinking anything. And we're all tired. So we're all like, oh, the water's going. We're all celebrating, giving high fives. And also we look down and the canoe is starting to float to the surface because we had put this foam underneath it that obviously is very buoyant. And the canoe is very buoyant. And so we took our pants off and dove in and jumped in the vat and took the and made some changes and saved the day again. So another example of, you got to have these plans and we got to be ready to act. And it was a bit like, being in some kind of a battle where you don't know what's next. When you're doing archaeology in general, one of the exciting parts of it is you don't know what you're going to find, and you don't know how it's going to come out, and you don't know. And so that's part of the buzz we get from doing this thing. We don't know what's there. No one's seen this in 1,200 years. So it worked, though. What would have happened if I had a little story in my head if it was not successful? What was I going to tell people? Luckily I didn't have to.
Very thankful. Very thankful.
Yeah.
And this canoe will now be telling its story to generations of people, reminding from school children on up to all of us elders of who was here on the land, the Ho-Chunk, and it will be speaking and saying that those stories are there if we listen in the right way. I think it's particularly poignant since the Native American community in the United States just lost Clyde Bellecourt yesterday. Very important, very significant leader of AIM and a voice for the Native people of this nation for a very, very long time, going back to a time when there was so much resistance. And now we are, as the representatives of the people of Wisconsin, going to see this piece of their lives be front and center in our new museum celebrating all of our heritage. And I think that's very poetic and very fitting. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, all you visitors, for having joined us and participated and shared this experience and shared your questions. Look to the Historical Society of Wisconsin's website so that you can find, first of all, I've seen a lot of questions about donating, and that's where the links for that will be. This talk will be available. And Amy, where will that be connected, linked?
It'll be linked in along with the other presentations for Charlie Brown and webinars that the Maritime bunch has got. It will be at wisconsinhistory.org. And I believe there is some talk about putting it on our YouTube channel as well.
Fantastic. All right. So I will not keep people any longer. I don't want Amy to get in trouble with the building security as she leaves, as they're locking up. So on behalf of everyone here, I again will thank everyone. Please have a good and safe evening, and take care of yourselves and be well. And good night.